You're listening to the Balanced Educator Podcast, episode number 151. Welcome to the Balanced Educator. We're your hosts, Kaylee
and Josiane from EduCalm. Our intention is to equip and empower you to feel more calm, balanced, and joyful in all aspects of your life.
Hello there and welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us today. So in today's episode, I'm interviewing Richard Capriola. He's been a mental health and addictions counselor for over 2 decades. He recently retired from Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, where over a decade he treated adolescents and adults diagnosed with substance use disorders. He's the author of a new book for families entitled The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. Now, I'm really excited for you to hear this interview because we talk about what teachers need to know about drug use in teens and adolescents and what we can do to be there as a support for those students and those families that are affected. So in this episode, we talk about which drugs teens are using these days, what is on the rise, and what is the most kind of popular drugs that we need to be looking out for. We talk about what are the warning signs that we as teachers need to be aware of and familiar with, and what are important for parents to be familiar with as well. We talk about how drugs work in the teen brain, how using these drugs is going to affect their brain short and long term, and how the pandemic has impacted teen mental health and how that is leading to potentially more substance abuse and compulsive behaviors. Richard also gives recommendations on how teachers and schools can reach teens in a meaningful way that can impact a child's decision to not use illicit drugs and alcohol. So this is a new topic for this podcast. We are really excited to share it because as a teacher in a high school, this is something that I've been thinking about and been wanting more information on. So really looking forward to sharing this information with you. All right. Before we get into the episode, we're excited to share this week's sponsor. Do you want to incorporate social-emotional learning and mindfulness into your classroom to support students with mental health, focus, self-regulation, and emotional intelligence? With so much on your plate as a teacher, you probably just don't have the time to get extensive training, to develop your own resources, and to then teach the lessons. Plus, you've got so much on your plate. You need time during the day for self-care too. So that's why we developed EduCalm, to support teachers like you. EduCalm is a fully bilingual English and French co-regulation program created by teachers. So this program provides everything you'll need to build self-regulation, mindfulness, and social-emotional skills with your students through a 5-minute daily practice. You just have to log in, press play, and prepare your minds and bodies for calm and focused teaching and learning. Go to educalm.com to learn more and to start using our free resources. Go to educalm.com, so that's spelled educalme.com to learn more and start using our free resources. All right, let's get into this episode with Richard Capriola. Hello, Richard. Thank you so much for being with us here today on the podcast.
Hello, Kaylee. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm really excited to dive into the topic that you have to share with us today on adolescent mental health and substance abuse. This is something that I think teachers really need to be aware of, and we haven't covered this topic on the podcast yet, but it's so important. So we're so excited to have your expertise with us here today to share with our audience. Before we get started, can you introduce yourself to us and let us know, how did life lead you to where you are today?
Well, it's been a rather long journey. I started out in education, where I was a state-level school administrator for the State Board of Education in Illinois. And I transitioned after about 30 years of working in education to mental health, and started out working at a mental health a regional crisis center. And I noticed that a number of people that were coming to the crisis center from emergency rooms had not only a mental health crisis, but also were struggling with a substance abuse disorder. So I went back to the University of Illinois and obtained more training and a degree in what is basically substance abuse counseling. And then I accepted a position at Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, which is a large psychiatric hospital that serves adolescents and adults from around the world. And I worked at Menninger for over a decade, treating both adolescents and adults who have mental health and substance abuse disorders. And so many times I would sit across from a family and I would go through the history of their child's using a substance, what drugs they had been using, how early an age they started and how often they used, and give them the diagnosis of a substance use disorder. And they would look across at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they might say, I sort of thought something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. Mm-hmm. So after I left Menninger, I wanted to write this resource for parents and teachers and counselors and social workers that would give them the basic information on adolescent substance abuse. Now, parents are very busy. Teachers are very busy. We're all very busy. So we don't have time to read volumes of information. So I kept this book at around 100 pages. But I packed it with a lot of information, such as a brief review of street drugs, how drugs work within the teenage brain, what warning signs should parents and teachers and counselors know about, what treatment options are out there that can be considered. How do you know what a good treatment program looks like? What does an evidence-based treatment program look like? And what kinds of questions should parents ask a potential treatment provider? And then I put in resources. So I packed all of that into about 100 pages. My goal is that people can read this book very quickly and walk away thinking, okay, I've got this. I understand this a little bit better. I'm not as paranoid about this as I used to be. And if I have to confront it, I feel better prepared to do so now.
That sounds like such a useful resource. I love that you kept it short and sweet. It's so true. We have, as teachers and parents, there are so many things that you're juggling, so many aspects of the children in front of you that you're trying to support them with. It's so wide and vast, the different hats that we wear. So this, we need this information, but in a way that we actually have time to get to it. So everything you cover in your book sounds so useful, and I would love to dive into all the things you talked about. Maybe let's start off with, what are the drugs out there right now that teens are using, so that teachers, parents kind of at least have an idea of what's out there. What do we need to be paying attention to?
Sure. And this is the title of this book is, The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. But it is also, I think, a very valuable resource for teachers, because I think teachers sometimes, because they're so much in contact with students, often see these signs first. So if teachers can become a little better informed about the warning signs, perhaps they may be the first one to catch on that there's something going on here, because kids are very clever. They know how to fly under the radar. And parents sometimes just don't want to discuss this topic. They don't want to believe it can happen to them. So teachers sometimes can be the first signal that something's going on. So I hope that every teacher will take the time to read the book and become familiar with the warning signs. But you ask about what drugs kids are taking today. Kids are still attracted to alcohol and marijuana. Those are still the two primary drugs. And that's been true for a long, long period of time. There still is some experimentation with the harder core drugs like cocaine and LSD, but really less than 5%. Most teenagers are attracted to alcohol and marijuana, but what we have noticed that is rather alarming is that in the last few years, there has been a significant increase in adolescents vaping things like nicotine and marijuana. Just in the last 3 years, the percentage of teenagers who have turned to vaping these substances substances has exploded. It is a dramatic increase, and it's rather alarming that the percentages are going up so quickly, where these kids are turning to vaping things like nicotine and marijuana. That's been the biggest change in the last 3 years.
Yeah, and as a teacher, I can attest to that. It's just, it scares me so much as a teacher, just seeing how many students, and it's so discreet. These little vaping devices are so small and sneaky and addictive. So I'd love to know, is there information you can share specifically on vaping? Just because I feel like that's something that makes its way into schools and potentially more than the other substances that teens are using. What do teachers do about that? How do we give students the information they need to understand maybe the dangers of it, or because I feel that they don't understand how addictive it is?
Yeah, that's true. And the thing is that tobacco smoking among adolescents is at an all-time low, which is good. But what's happened is teenagers have moved from smoking tobacco to vaping nicotine. And they'll tell you they think it's a lot safer because with tobacco, you get a lot of carcinogens besides just the tobacco. And that's true. And they think, well, just vaping nicotine without all the carcinogens in tobacco is safer. No, that's not true. Because what's happening is while they're vaping nicotine, they're getting higher concentrations of nicotine, which is affecting the developing immature brain much more quickly. And the same is true with marijuana. Marijuana also already is a lot more potent than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they're getting concentrations of marijuana quicker by vaping too. And regardless of the substance, it's just not healthy to be taking something, turning it into a vapor and inhaling it into our system. Teachers, I think, can become better aware of the devices that you just noticed, because many of them you wouldn't recognize as a vaping device. Some of them look like pins. Some of them look like USB drives. So parents don't know about them. Teachers aren't familiar with them, but it would be good if every teacher would just read a little bit more about it and become familiar with it, and just be aware that adolescent vaping is really, really significantly increasing among teenagers today.
Mm-hmm. And are there any kind of strategies that you would recommend for giving teens the information they need to avoid vaping and some of these other substances that teens are using? Like, how do we tell them in a way that is going to stick that they shouldn't be experimenting with these things that could potentially lead to a lot of harm?
Well, actually, the education format, teachers, the education system has the potential to make significant changes in adolescent substance abuse, far more than families do, as a matter of fact.
Interesting.
What I found in my years of working with teenagers at Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, was it didn't do me any good to tell them the drugs were bad. It didn't do me any good to tell them the drugs were illegal. It didn't do me any good to tell them if they keep smoking marijuana or drinking alcohol or whatever they're using, that their grades are going to drop. They might not graduate from high school. They might not get into college, and they might not get a job. They didn't believe any of that. But what did capture their attention was the neuroscience of addiction. When I talked to them about how their brain worked, when I educated them about the developing brain, and they began to understand that our brains don't become fully developed until around age 24, 25. And I helped them see that different parts of the brain control different critical activities. There's a part of the brain that helps us remember things. There's a part of the brain that helps us see. There's a part of the brain that helps us talk. There's a part of the brain that helps us walk. And educate them on the importance of the brain and what it does, and that it's maturing. And then once they grasped that understanding, introduced how drugs affect the brain so that they could see how marijuana affected the brain and these different drugs, that captured their attention. So my recommendation for teachers and for the education system is begin that process. Focus on the neuroscience. Help these kids understand the importance of their developing brain. Help these kids understand that they need to protect their brain. Help these kids understand what the brain does. And then how do these drugs affect the brain? In my book, I have a slide that shows where marijuana attaches itself to the brain. And when I showed that to these kids, they immediately connected marijuana and its impact on the brain so that they could see, now I understand why marijuana causes me to be so slow. Now I understand why my short-term memory isn't as good as I like it to be. They began to understand that these drugs affect the brain. So my recommendation for teachers is you can play a significant role in changing the course of adolescents' using of substances by taking the role of teaching them about the neuroscience, how the brain works, and then introducing how these drugs affect the brain.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think everyone, adults and teens and kids alike, are so intrigued by how the brain works. So to get them where we can pique their curiosity and get them interested in discovering this information, that makes so much sense to take that approach, because we've all been teenagers. We know that when someone tells us not to do something, we want to do it more, right? It's just part of the development.
And that's a process that the school systems can start in the elementary grades. So when the children are preteens in elementary school, you can begin to introduce the education component, the neuroscience part of it, so that by the time they reach middle school or high school, they have a good education, a good foundation of the neuroscience of the brain. They understand what the brain is, they understand what it does, and they understand the different parts of the brain. That can be learned during elementary school. And then as they reach the junior years and the high school years, since they have an understanding of how the brain works, because you taught that to them in elementary school, you can begin to introduce how drugs affect the brain in, their junior years, in their high school years.
That makes so much sense, kind of laying that foundation and building on it so they already know the importance of the brain. And then we start talking about how these things that they might start encountering, how that is going to, negatively affect the brain or impact the brain. So I'm intrigued. Would we be able to go a little bit deeper into how maybe some of these specific, most common substances are affecting the adolescent brain?
Yeah. Let me give you an example of marijuana, because that's one of the most widely used drugs among teenagers. The kids that I worked with at Menninger Clinic, many of them were smoking marijuana, often multiple times a day. And when I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. So for a lot of kids, not all kids, but for a lot of kids, there is a mental health issue underneath the surface that is driving these kids to use a substance like marijuana. It's what I call an intolerable thought or an intolerable feeling or an intolerable memory. And kids are no different than adults. When we have those intolerable feelings, we don't want to sit with them. We want to get rid of them. And many times kids find marijuana is the substance that will help them relieve their anxiety or their depression or their trauma or whatever they're dealing with. And these kids were all very bright. Many of them had above average to superior high IQs, but they were smoking marijuana multiple times a day. When the psychological and the neuropsychological test results came back on these kids, what I noticed was the processing speed of their brain was below average. Their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was really very low. So those are some examples of what we can see about how these drugs affected the brains of these kids who were using so much marijuana. And these are changes that might not be readily observable to teachers because they're making good grades, or to parents because their kids are doing really well. But when you dig below the surface and you get the psychological or the neuropsychological test results back, many times you can see the subtle changes that drugs like marijuana are beginning to make within the adolescent brain.
Right. So that makes me curious now to learn more about, as teachers and as parents, what are some of the warning signs that we should be looking for? This connection between mental health and drug abuse makes sense. These students are looking for ways to self-medicate. They're looking for ways to relieve the pain that they're in. And this was the way that they found for now. So as life is getting tough through the pandemic and stuff, we're seeing a lot more difficulties in the mental health area. Most teachers are very aware that there are mental health changes within their classrooms that are very noticeable compared to past years. So what are we looking for as teachers to when this could be a problem?
Well, anytime you suspect that a child might be struggling with a mental health issue, regardless of whether it's anxiety or depression or trauma, or perhaps it's an emerging personality disorder that you've picked up on, then I think that's a good time to do a screening to see if there is any substance use in addition to what you suspect might be a mental health issue. Mm-hmm. I would use your suspicion of a mental health issue sort of as a trigger to looking into whether or not this child might have a substance use issue as well, and having somebody do a quick assessment to see to either rule in or rule out whether or not the child is using a substance. So I would use your instinct on picking up on perhaps a potential mental health issue as being a trigger to do an addictions assessment with that child. Right. In my book, I list warning signs, specific warning signs for alcohol, warning signs for marijuana. I have warning signs for a child that might be self-harming themselves, because that often flies underneath the surface. Parents and teachers often don't know that a child is cutting themselves or self-harming themselves. And I have warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder. These are all warning signs that every parent and every teacher should at least be familiar with, because kids are very clever. A kid that might be a teenager that might be cutting on themselves, they're very clever. They know how to do it in ways that parents don't catch on to, that teachers never catch on to. But there are warning signs that you can look for. So try to become as familiar with the warning signs as you can as a teacher and as a parent. For parents, what I say is pay attention to the changes you see in your child. You know your child better than anyone, so pay attention to the changes that you see. Don't assume that the changes that you're seeing are just normal adolescent acting out behaviors. They may very well be that, but they also may be an indicator that there's something else going on underneath the surface. Some examples would be a child whose grades are declining. Why are the grades declining? A child that might be getting into disciplinary trouble at school. A child who used to participate in sports no longer wants to participate in sports. A child who used to openly tell you who their friends were. You knew who their friends were. You might have even known who their family members were. Now becomes very secretive of who their friends are. So these are some examples of changes that we can see in children. If they come and go fairly quickly, they're probably not too concerning. But if they tend to linger on, or you begin to see more and more of these changes, then I think it's time to get concerned and move to the next stage, which is to get the assessments done.
Right. And and I think that's a big barrier for both teachers and parents is, okay, I'm seeing these warning signs. Now what? Who do I go to? Where do I reach out to? That navigating the system can be very challenging and overwhelming. So what would you suggest is kind of the first step, the first place to look, no matter where you live? Because of course it's going to be a little bit different everywhere. But what would your suggestion be?
I would start with the school counselor or the school social worker. Many times they can do some of these assessments. If not, they can refer you to other professionals in the community that can do those assessments for you. Sometimes they can do a rapid screen to see if drugs are involved. Some of them, the social worker, or if there's a school psychologist on the staff, can do some more of these testing for you. So I would begin by talking, first of all, to the school teacher, and then I would talk to the school counselor or the social worker or the school psychologist. Another source would be your physician. Many times the physicians can do a rapid screen, or they can refer you to other professionals like psychologists or neuropsychologists that can do these assessments. You can also check with the mental health society, the professional mental health society in your community. But I would probably start with consulting with the classroom teacher and then the school counselor or social worker or school psychologist.
Right. And then coming from sort of the other way, so that, if a parent notices the signs, they would come to the teacher. As a teacher, how do you take the steps to connect with the parents and breach this subject?
I think because teachers may be one of the first people to pick up on something, that I think that if you are really concerned that the child might have a mental health issue or might have a substance abuse issue, you definitely need to call the parents in and tell them what you're observing, give them some examples, and make your recommendations as to what you feel the next steps might be. And most likely those are going to be to recommend to the parents that they get some more professional assessments done to get an overview and to either rule in or rule out things that are going on. And before you get to that stage, depending on your relationship with the student, you might want to have a conversation with the student. If they trust you, if they develop that relationship with you, they might actually open up and talk about some of these issues with you where they may not do that with their parents. So depending on the relationship that you have with the student, you may want to have a discussion with them about what's going on. And by that, I mean not to accuse them of anything, not to threaten them. You want to approach it from an inquiring point of view, a curiosity point of view. I'm seeing these behaviors. Can you help me understand what I'm seeing? I've noticed that you've been doing these things. Can you help me understand why I'm noticing these things? And see if the student will open up and share some information with you.
That's really good advice. Awesome. Now, I'd love to talk more about the pandemic and how the pandemic specifically has affected student mental health and addictions. Things are really changing, and if you have any information to share on that, that'd be great.
There are some alarming statistics starting to come out about how the pandemic has affected mental health for both adults and for kids. This pandemic has gone on for so long, and then for a period of time, everybody was shut in at home. Students weren't going to school. Parents weren't going to work. A lot of anxiety, a lot of fears. And I think we're just now beginning to scratch the surface on how the pandemic has affected mental health. Mental health for adults and mental health for adolescents. The United States Surgeon General has issued a report, which is rather alarming on some of the statistics about what's been going on with the adolescent population. We're seeing increases in suicidal ideation. We're seeing increases in mental health areas like depression and anxiety. We're just seeing now how this pandemic has affected the mental health of people, including adolescents. And I think the more we learn, the more alarming it's going to become over time as to how this pandemic has affected kids.
Yeah, Oof. My hope is that we find ways to turn this awful experience we've all had into strengths, and that we all kind of have this amazing muscles that we've built moving forward. At least I have kind of faith or like a positive outlook that worst case scenario, at least this experience has brought mental health so much more to the forefront and the importance of mental health to the forefront. And luckily schools are responding and making mental health a priority, which didn't necessarily happen in the past. We're understanding now that mental health is step one and then we can build on that. So
I think that's a great point. And I think we are moving in that direction as more and more people talk about this issue, that more statistics come out and more reports come out, bringing this entire issue of mental health to the foreground. I think it not only will educate us, but alert us to what's going on and lead to a more proactive stance in terms of being able to recognize it and treat it, not just among the adolescent population, but among the adult population as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was such an excellent conversation. Your book, I think, will be such a wonderful resource for teachers and parents, short and sweet, to give them the information that they need to know to be able to support adolescents, especially during these difficult times where mental health is at the forefront and we are seeing a decline in our classrooms, and know that we need to be there for our students, but don't always have the tools. So how can our listeners connect with you and find your book and find more information about you?
The easiest way, Kaylee, is to go to the book's website, which is www.helptheaddictedchild.com. helptheaddictedchild.com. When they go to the website, they can read about me, they can read endorsements, they can read book reviews, they can read a sample chapter from the book. There's also a parent handbook that I would encourage teachers to take a look at, because it might be a resource that teachers can give to parents. I wrote the parent workbook to help parents. All the time we focus on the child, and we recognize that the parent's going through their own crisis. So I wanted to put together a brief workbook that would give them some exercises to help them put on paper what they're going through. It also has some exercise on how to deal with anxiety and how to talk to your child by listening to their feelings as well as their words. So they can read a little bit about both the book and the workbook. There's a link that will take them to Amazon where they can order the book as either a Kindle, if they like to read on a Kindle, or it's available in a paperback. And they can also, if they're interested, order the workbook. It'll take them directly to Kindle. And there's also a tab where they can, if they're interested, send me a message or ask me a question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We will link all of that in our show notes as well.
Great.
So for our listeners, you can always find that information by going to our show notes, either right in your podcast app or by going to our website, educom.com/blog, and selecting the podcast episode that you want the information on. So Richard, thank you again so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. And thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. It's so important.
Thank you, Kaylee. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you and all the teachers out there for the hard work that they do every day to help kids learn and to grow. So thank you for all the work that you do as well.
All right. I really enjoyed that interview. I hope you did too, and you got lots of value from it. So again, you can find the show notes for this episode, the links to Richard's information at educom.com/blog, and then finding this episode, which is episode 151. If you've never checked out the blog page of our website, definitely check it out. At this point, we are at episode 151. We have so much awesome free resources, free information, trainings, all sorts of stuff on our blog. So many podcast episodes that can fuel your interests, your curiosity, and, give you that uplifting professional development that you might want to listen to on the way to your job, on the way home from work, while you're cooking supper, whatever. But yeah, don't miss out on all that free resources that we've created just for you and teachers like you. All right. If you enjoyed today's topic, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us either from our website. You can go to educalm.com/contact and fill out the form there and we'll receive an email. Or send us a DM on Instagram. We're Educalm on Instagram as well. So that's EDUCALME. We'd love to know if there's something about this topic that you'd like us to go into more detail, or another direction that you'd like us to take for adolescent mental health and substance abuse, or anything related to the pandemic. We love hearing your feedback, so don't be shy to reach out to us. We absolutely love hearing from you. It's so fun. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and you got value from it, please share it with a friend or a colleague that you think would enjoy it and get value from it too. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. Have a wonderful week.